Good evening, everybody. My name's Andrew Buckley. A few months ago, I was with American Express. I was with them for quite a while, looking after product management. And very recently, I joined MasterCard with a whole new job looking after product management, marketing. We're going to talk today. Asen was a consultant that worked for me when I was at American Express. We had a particular problem about how marketing were working with IT. And so we're going to talk to you about those kind of issues that we had. In particular, I don't know, how many of you put in some kind of lead nurturing tool? Anyone have Eloqua, Silverpop? Yeah, a few people with that. We chose Eloqua. It was a very, very big investment for us. We rolled it out globally. I'm not recommending Eloqua, just to be clear. They're all marvelous products, but just putting a lead nurturing tool in was quite a big tech investment for us. And then there's other tools such as a Primo, some of the automation tools. Anyone putting a big automation tool in? Anyone done that recently?
We're just in the middle of it at the moment.
Yeah, it's all encompassing, isn't it?
It's huge. Moved from Siebel to Salesforce.com and all the associated marketing.
Yeah, we had the same thing. We used to have Siebel at American Express. We moved to Salesforce. It took us many years to do that. Unfortunately, it was. Sorry, just to tell you that. And we had a few goes at it. But anyway, skipping over that. And then you've got other modern tools, like you've got all the content management tools for web. Perhaps you're responsible for those. In my old roles and my new role, I'm somehow get the budget for that. And then also you've got some of the modern tools like I told you to put a name check in for Wildfire, which is a social media tracking tool. There's lots of those around. Sure, you're getting a lot of pressure from your business leaders to how you can track all this kind of thing, and just taking them out of the box and not integrating with your system seems pretty challenging in my experience. We've had a few bumps in the road. So that's the context for today's presentation, and we're really going to talk through a case study, and apparently we have to move over to here, and not be too far over there. Camera's over there.
On the screen as well.
Ruining that. We're going to talk really very practically about certainly my experience of doing that. I appreciate yours may be different, but we're trying to give you some insights to that. Does that make sense? Great. Asen, over to your introduction.
Hello. So thank you, Andrew, for kind of briefly explaining who I am. I work for EMC Consulting. I'm a strategy consultant there. I had a good fortune to work with Andrew on this project that we're about to open up on in a little bit. I think what I share with a lot of what it looks like marketing people is actually, in my past experience, I didn't have a lot to do with technology. I was mostly an innovation and growth consultant, and particularly in the development of business cases. So in my role at EMC, I was kind of confronted with with the big chasm that exists between marketing and technology. So I'll kind of be speaking both as an outsider to this world, but also I have some substantial experience as well as an insider to the world about actually what things you can actually do to begin to speak to technology a little bit better and a little bit more effectively. Now, some of you might be familiar with this statement, but and it's a rhetorical question. But what really is wrong with this statement, and could you possibly recall if you've seen that statement? Do you recognize it at all? That stat? Anybody raise their hand? Okay. Well, I was hoping that would be news to you, but it's been around for a few months now. Well, McKinsey reports that on average, IT projects tend to run about 45% over budget, 7% over time, and deliver 56% less value. Now, you aren't in the business of IT, but increasingly, you are beginning to interface with your IT organization far more frequently than you traditionally have. And you also have to dedicate some substantial budgets to IT implementation, which have to do, as Andrew mentioned, with email marketing, automation, CRM, all sorts of technologies that are substantial amounts of effort and resources on your end. So what ends up happening is you need to speak to IT people and you spend a lot of money on that front. So in my experience, that there's often a cultural challenge as well, and one of methodologies. So there are two methodologies which I want to contrast for the benefit of this session, and you will know the first one, which is fundamentally Waterfall. And as
sorry, just to interrupt, how many of you come across the idea of IT methodology called Waterfall? Few of you. Okay.
Thank you. Well, it does merit an explanation in that case. Well, it's the traditional gather requirements, assess, design, develop, test, and implement. Very linear approach to implementation. Now, why is it called a waterfall? Well, I have my own theory, and I think it is very much like a waterfall, where the whole project looks like it's going to be one nice long journey with a good sort of happy ending. But what ends up happening is very much like you just reached that big waterfall in the Zambezi River. It ends up falling down quite badly, and the project doesn't get delivered. There's loads of tears, and inevitably a lot of share of blame exchange. So to contrast that with Agile, and once again, I need to highlight that this is an oversimplified version. There is a lot of writing on the internet, and there's a lot of specialists who will talk about how that's actually.
So again, just to context, how many people have come across Agile or Scrum or?
Oh wow.
Okay, so quite a few people.
Very good. Well, perhaps I can humor you in my analogy, but Agile is very much like you are going through a bunch of streams at a very fast pace. You work in a very you work in a broken down manner where you deliver incremental value for the project, and you end up getting something which is more than what most IT implementations will tend to deliver in the first place. Now, if you were to draw a very basic comparison between the two methodologies, what Waterfall tends to require is that you have a fixed set of requirements, and you will end up estimating resources and time dedicated to the project, which is, of course, a formula for a scope creep at some stage of the journey. With Agile, you end up planning on the go, so you will have fixed resources, budget, and time, and the features of what you're about to implement may change over the course of the exercise.
And so, in terms of sort of my learning of the things that I've done, I think one error that I've made, or one learning, is that I wasn't clear enough with my IT partners about what methodology they were using for different projects. And I've come across people with similar issues where, for example, in one case, I've come across where they started with a waterfall method. So they wrote the big requirements document, the big thick document. And then once they'd written that, they switched to an agile approach of these sprints. So they deliver every 3 weeks. In my case, we had one example where I thought they were going to use an agile method. I only found out later it was actually a waterfall method. And so there were various sort of bumps in the road there. And so certainly my experience would be, based on my errors, is to be very clear about your IT partners, which kind of methodology they're using, particularly when they're putting in packages like Eloqua or some of these sort of things, because exactly how each individual department works or how each piece works is often quite different. And based upon that, if it's waterfall, for those of you who've done that, it's very requirements intensive. You typically write a requirements document, you'll have lots of workshops, and you'll sign it off at the end. And it's normally a big paper-based document. In Amex terms, it's actually part of our reporting. It's a very significant piece of sign-off document. And then you'll go a stepwise process. You'll go through analysis, design, build, and test, and you'll deliver. And at the end of the project, you will have the big launch, and the thing will arrive. And in terms of, I think it's dropped off here, but I think a key sort of question to ask is, what's the resource spin-down diagram? So for those of you who not have come across that before, basically somewhere in the project plan, they'll have a timeline diagram and a spend. So they'll forecast how much they'll spend each month or each week from the beginning of the project to the end. And certainly one thing that I've seen with really great IT project managers, and it's Booz Allen Hamilton methodology, I think originally, is ask for that diagram. Because if they're underspending against their trend, so if they said by week 3 they'd have spent 20% of the budget, if they've underspent by week 3, that means they're going to be late. Whatever they tell you, they're going to be late. If they've overspent, that means they're going to be overspent. It's not that they're early, because what they'll tell you is, yes, we've spent 27% on analyze, and perhaps you've got better experience, but they'll say, but we're spending more time on understanding the needs so that it'll be much quicker to develop when we get around to the development phase. That's not what happens. What happens is if they overspend at the beginning, they're going to overspend all the rest of it, and they're going to come to you at some point and say, of the 17 requirements you wanted, we've got to cut 3 off, or you've got to give me another $1 million. So asking for that diagram, it's called a resource chart, spin down chart, lots of names for it, I think is key. In terms of Agile, certainly projects I've been experienced with and I've come across in preparing for this, I've been asking various questions. There's lots of different names for it, but there's the idea of a product owner. You can actually do a qualification, you become a certified product owner. And I've come across a number of projects, quite big marketing projects, where the product owner is a tech person. And so the Agile methodology, if you haven't come across it, what they have is they have a backlog of needs. And every sprint, they look at those 15 needs and they prioritize or they groom them, is what they call them. And the product owner is the person who every week or every 2 weeks, whatever it is, they have what's called a stand-up meeting every week. And every 3 weeks, they get together and they prioritize the backlog. And that decides what they've done. And what I've seen and what I've heard about is that because in marketing you've got other goals and other plans, quite often we're not resourced or trained to take part in that meeting. And therefore somebody else is prioritizing our project. And so therefore when you get to the end of the project, unfortunately what happens is, in my case, you've gone and promised to the head of sales that you're going to deliver this new tool which does lead nurturing or whatever, which is going to do these 14 things. And in actual fact, it's only doing 7 of them. And I haven't set his or her expectation. And so I think with Waterfall, kind of the key question is, ask for one of these diagrams, one of these resource spend diagrams. They've always got one somewhere. It's always in the system somewhere, be it days or whatever. There's even a book called The Mythical Man Month. Have you heard about that? There's a famous book, The Mythical Man Month. Ask for that diagram and track it. Ignore everything else they say and track it. And on Agile, it's who's the product owner. They've got to be trained and they've got to put a day a week into the project. And certainly that's my experience.
And I think that leads quite nicely into the substance of what we wanted to talk about. And I think Andrew is going to tell us a little bit about the benefit it brought into Amex.
So we had a project that was, in effect, a product rebuild. And we'd gone through the requirements document, the 74 pages of document. And the cost of that was very substantial. It was tens of millions of dollars. And the way that worked is that the marketing people sat through all these workshops. We wrote it all up. They then broke it up into sections and they sent it out to the different tech teams. So for example, if you're putting a package in, quite often there's a package configuration team. And then normally it's got some back-end integration with some kind of database, be it Salesforce or be it some customer database. And there's a separate team that does that. And then normally there's some other separate team that's doing some other kind of bit of integration. And so what happened is we wrote this big document, it got broken up, it got sent out, and back came a quote for tens of millions of dollars. There's a lot of screaming, blood on the carpet. I ended up in a lot of trouble. And I decided to take a story-based approach. For those of you who haven't done that before, in the academic literature, the idea of using stories, particularly for small businesses, is very well proven as a way of driving innovation. And a lot of startups use they may not call it a story-based approach, but it's a very, very well-known approach. And in Agile, it's a key element of Agile.
Absolutely. I mean, stories are well documented as a way of driving out requirements in Agile. And just to create a contrast between what a traditional requirement is and what a use story may be, if you look at the statement above, whilst it might look slightly programmatic, it's basically, as somebody, an end user, I would like to achieve a particular goal, and I expect to get a certain benefit. Now that would be a typical formulation of how you would create a user story. How would you ask the question that will give you a user story in return? A typical requirement statement is far simpler and it's easy to understand. It's far more granular, but it will essentially say that a system will provide a particular benefit. Now, what's the difference between those two statements? One has the end user and the other one doesn't. So what happens is for every actor or end user for whom you write a requirement, there's various permutations of why they might use that particular functionality. and what needs they might have associated with them. So when you start an implementation on the basis of requirement that's defined this way, inevitably you're going to miss a pretty substantial piece of information. And as a result of that, you will end up creating a huge amount of, or a significant amount of change that will have to occur as a result of an improper implementation.
So how many of you have been involved in writing user stories like this with Agile? A few people. It's quite hard. Well, perhaps it's easy for you, but I actually find it quite tough. And I know you've got some blank faces out, but I swear this is true, that there literally is quite a rigorous approach to how you write them. They have to be on those index cards. The people who are into this are very adamant about the process. Yeah. So they're on index cards, you put them in a certain way, you write them in a certain way. It is a whole world of language that they use to write these things. And for those of you who've written them, I know some hands at the back. They're very strict about how they write stories, aren't they, and the process. And you have these things called epic stories, and there's a whole process around this that is interesting if you've never done it before, a polite way. But there's lots of really good research that, particularly with marketing people and particularly with things which are customer focused, to use the academic jargon, it's very dense information. Yeah. So this, as a customer, I want to see a discount if X and Y. The information density and the ability to communicate between different groups is shown to be very, very good. Very, very good. And that's what we did in this particular example that I had. And
I think one of the outputs of the work that we did with Amex was basically, as I'm sure Andrew will be able to speak in a lot more detail with what led to the actual project. I mean, we had a number of sessions with various tech stakeholders and also with product owners to distill back out to actually what are the core user stories that we need to address. And then we develop these epics, broken down into steps, particular tasks, and associated benefits. And the actors, so we had design targets for a specific user group, and then we gave that design target particular tasks, and we then anticipated the benefits that will come out as a result of the completion of that task.
So the example is a particular set of products that we had, very successful, been around for a long time, and it was fascinating to go through it. First of all, the number of arguments between the people about what the products did and what the customer needs were was interesting, to say the least. Took quite a long time, and we had the pleasure of paying EMC to listen while my team argued with each other about what exactly the need was. It also brought out that our design target, how we described our customer, was not good enough, frankly, and we need to improve that. And really brought out this idea of actors, who we were really selling to, who the people we were trying to influence. And then breaking it down into what actually the value that they got was also very insightful. And so what we did, I hired EMC, and again, I'm not particularly recommending EMC. They were the people that came to do this for us, but we hired a consulting firm. They only did really a couple of weeks' work on this. It was a fairly short engagement. They basically interviewed all my team, interviewed some of the customer salespeople, some of the service people. They did some research. They wrote 6 epic stories.
Total 6 epics.
Yeah, 6 epics. And then I used that to get all the tech people and some of the process people in a room. And it ended up as a video conference. Most of us were in New York, but we had people all over the US. And I got the very senior leaders in, which is an interesting dynamic because I've never attended one of these before. So I got the sort of president level people in a room with all these people. And we went through these stories. We had a 3-hour workshop. And the outcome of this is that we realized that some of the ways we were designing this product, so some of the trade-offs we were making, were really very inappropriate. And it turned out that one of the tech teams had built something in the 90s that kind of did what we needed. So all we had to do was basically retest that, and we had our product. So what was a 2.5-year development, tens of millions of dollars, was less than a year and less than $10 million. So it was quite an eye-opening activity. And really, sounds very simple, but it was a case of corralling them in a room, getting them to buy into the process, which wasn't straightforward, getting them to agree. And in hindsight, I sort of pick on you. You mentioned you're going Salesforce, etc. If only we'd done that with the Salesforce implementation, because missed expectations, phased implementations, all kind of bumps in the road, really would have helped a lot. But we didn't do that. Nobody read the 70 pages of document. We had the usual bumps in the road. It was late. It was over budget. People got very upset. Had to restart various issues. Everyone tried very hard, but it's just the reality of these things. And so that's why I was fascinated by this approach, and it really exceeded my expectations. I thought I was going to get fired for it at one point.
So did I.
But it was there were some pretty upset people at times, because it was, and it's interesting. The SVP whose budget ultimately was, his biggest problem was, why was it so cheap? Why have you never found this before? Why is it so cheap? So that's our story, really, a story of using stories.
I think, just to recap, perhaps, there's a lot of people who've used that approach before, but fundamentally, it tends to be quite inclusive. So, we spoke to a huge amount of people, which probably should have been consulted to begin with. We even rang some of our, we rang customers as well. There is kind of at the end of each story, you have a very clear benefit statement, a clear end play. So it's quite a compelling argument for why you should do something. It's fairly transparent, given the amount of people we consulted. I don't know how quite it's moved on once we hand it over. You do get a shared understanding of what actually is at stake for the business of that particular implementation, and also for the end customer. And I think it allowed a lot of learning to happen at a very fast pace.
And it set us up for an agile development, because we'd written all the epic stories, and then we could go through the breakdown of the different stories, and everyone was bought into it, and the senior leaders understood the scope of the trade-offs that they were making. So that's why the stories linked to the agile debate. Thank you very much. I don't know if we want to have some questions now, or should we try and take those for the panel at the end?
Take them at the panel. At the end, I think.
So thank you very much for listening to us. Hope that was interesting.